The parched alkali powder settled over White River like a death shroud coating every surface in a layer of grit that tasted of salt and desperation. Caroline Mercer stood in the ration line, her weathered boots sinking into what had once been the town's main street. The sun hammered down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that stole moisture from her cracked lips and strength from her trembling legs. She'd traded her bonnet 3 weeks ago, bartered it to the milliner's wife for half a sack of cornmeal that had barely lasted 5 days. Her children pressed against her tattered skirts like frightened shadows. Tommy, 8 years old, with his father's stubborn jaw and his mother's green eyes, stood rigid with the false bravery of a boy trying to be a man. Elsie, barely 5, clutched a corn-husk doll worn nearly transparent by small, desperate fingers. The child's lips were cracked and bloodless, her dress hanging loose on a frame that had been plump and rosy 6 months ago. The federal relief wagon squatted ahead, like a cruel promise, its bed groaning under burlap sacks stamped with government seals. Caroline's hollow stomach clenched at the sight. Around her, the line shuffled forward, with the mechanical patience of the starving homesteaders, with sunken eyes shopkeepers who'd shuttered their stores for lack of customers, even a few of Carr's laid-off ranch hands, who'd discovered that loyalty to a rich man meant nothing when drought made cattle worthless. Sheriff Horatio Pike stood beside the wagon, thumbs hooked in his gun belt, with the casual arrogance of a man who'd never missed a meal. His silver star caught the brutal sunlight, flashing like a taunt. 2 hired guns flanked him, Mean Mike Mallory, whose scarred knuckles told stories of homesteaders beaten for protesting water tolls, and Shorty Miller, a weasel-faced man who cradled a Springfield rifle like a lover. Shorty cradled a Springfield trapdoor model 1873 in 45-70. Pike's hand rested on a Colt Peacemaker. Several men carried Remington 1875s. When Caroline finally reached the distribution point, the clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy, who avoided her eyes, extended his hand toward a flour sack. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the rough burlap. Sheriff Pike cleared his throat, a sound like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. The noise carried across the street with deliberate volume. "Move her along." Timothy's hand jerked back as if the sack had burst into flames. His face flushed with shame, but he didn't argue. No one argued with Pike anymore, not since Franklin Mercer's funeral. Caroline's vision swam heat and hunger and fury, mixing into a nauseating cocktail. Her knees threatened to buckle. "My children haven't eaten since yesterday morning, Sheriff." "Should have paid your water toll, Mrs. Mercer." Pike's voice carried the satisfaction of a man enjoying his power. "Town's got no charity for debtors. Council made that real clear." The words landed like physical blows. Caroline felt every eye on the street turn toward her, some sympathetic, most simply grateful it wasn't them being denied. Her hands clenched into fists, nails biting into her palms, hard enough to draw blood. She forced her spine straight, refusing to collapse before these vultures who'd let corruption hollow out their town. Tommy's thin fingers tightened on her hand with painful intensity. Elsie whimpered a small animal sound that tore at Caroline's heart. Her legs trembled visibly now, muscles pushed beyond their limit by days of insufficient food and nights of worry that kept sleep at bay. A shadow fell across them, sudden and complete. Caroline looked up, squinting against the harsh light, to see a man stepping from the haze like an apparition. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with the fluid grace of someone utterly comfortable in his own body. His long black hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing high cheekbones and skin the warm brown of prairie earth after rain. He wore doeskin leggings, decorated with simple quill work, a faded cotton trade shirt, and moccasins that made no sound on the packed earth. A bone-handled knife hung at his hip in a beaded sheath, but he carried no firearm. The absence seemed deliberate a statement. The murmurs around them died instantly, as if someone had thrown a blanket over the crowd, White settlers regarded him with a wary, hostile suspicion, reserved for those they'd been taught to fear and despise. Despite the treaties signed years ago, despite the supposed peace, the sight of a Lakota warrior in town still triggered primitive responses, hands dropping to gun belts, mothers pulling children closer, men straightening with aggressive postures. The warrior seemed utterly unconcerned by the reaction. He knelt in the street directly before Caroline, his movements unhurried and deliberate. From a leather pouch at his side, he drew a bundle wrapped in faded blue cloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing hardtack bread, the kind that could last for months, and a generous portion of dried beans. He looked up, meeting Caroline's eyes directly. His gaze was steady, dark as river stones, and held no pity. Pity would have been unbearable. Instead, she saw simple recognition, one human being acknowledging another's need. "Take it." His voice was low and accented, but each word was clear. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. Her pride, the last thing she still possessed in abundance, warred with her children's hunger. Hunger won. It had to. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the bundle, a fleeting contact that somehow steadied her swaying balance. The food felt impossibly heavy in her hands, weighted with unexpected kindness from the last quarter she'd anticipated. Heat that had nothing to do with the sun prickled behind her eyes. "You got business here, Redskin." Pike's hand dropped to the Colt revolver, riding his hip fingers curling around the grip with practiced ease. The warrior rose slowly, positioning himself between the sheriff and the widow, with movements as deliberate as ritual. He stood perhaps 3 inches taller than Pike. And though he carried no gun, something in his stillness suggested violence held in check. A coiled spring, a cocked hammer. The crowd held its collective breath. Violence hung in the air, like lightning gathering before a storm, electric and inevitable. Mean Mike's hand drifted toward his own weapon. Shorty shifted the Springfield's barrel a fraction, not quite aiming, but ready. The moment stretched taut as wet rawhide drying in the sun, pulling tighter and tighter. "I have business," the Lakota man said quietly, his tone suggesting this was answer enough. "With those who need help." Pike's jaw worked, grinding his tobacco. His pale eyes flickered over the crowd, calculating. At least 40 witnesses watched from doorways and windows. Even he couldn't murder a man in broad daylight for an act of charity not without consequences that might ripple beyond his ability to control. The territorial governor had been making noises about frontier lawlessness, and Pike's arrangement with Lockwood depended on maintaining a veneer of legitimacy. Still, the sheriff's fingers twitched near the Colt's grip. The temptation was visible in his face, a hunger for violence that Caroline recognized with cold certainty. Finally, Pike spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the parched earth, deliberately aiming it near the warrior's moccasins. "Get moving, all of you. And Redskin, you be gone from this town by sundown, or I'll find reason to arrest you for vagrancy." The Lakota man inclined his head a fraction, acknowledging the threat without submitting to it. He stepped aside with fluid grace. Caroline hurried her children past legs, shaking so badly she nearly stumbled. Tommy and Elsie clutched her skirts as they fled, but Caroline glanced back once. The warrior still stood in the street, a pillar of granite amid the swirling dust. His dark eyes followed her until she turned the corner toward home. And even then, she felt the weight of his gaze, protective, assessing, utterly fearless. The drought was real enough. 2 summers of sparse rain had baked the territory until the earth split open like old leather. But the water shortage choking White River was something else entirely. A manufactured catastrophe designed to fill specific pockets while emptying others. The White River, named for the limestone foam that once churned over its rocky bed, flowed down from springs in the northern hills, through the town, and south toward the ranching country. Even with reduced rainfall, Those springs still produced enough water to sustain the town's 300 souls and the scattered homesteads dotting the valley, if distributed fairly. Gabriel Lockwood, the town banker, and Vincenzo Carr, whose cattle spread dominated the southern range, had engineered a different kind of distribution. 6 months earlier, they'd constructed a crude but effective wooden flume and sluice system a mile upriver from town. The structure diverted most of the river's flow, through a series of gates and timber channels, into a massive stock pond on Carr's property. The engineering was rough, thick timber frames, iron fittings salvaged from abandoned mine works, and a padlocked handwheel mechanism that controlled the water's path with mechanical precision. But it worked. The main channel through town had dwindled to a pathetic trickle, while Carr's stock pond swelled until it could water 10,000 head of cattle through the driest summer. Now homesteaders who wanted water paid tolls. $1 per week for access to the secondary channel that limped through town barely enough to fill a household bucket. $2 if you needed sufficient volume to irrigate even a small garden plot. Those who couldn't pay watched their crops wither into brown skeletons and their livestock die of thirst, bloated tongues protruding from slack mouths. The public wells fed by the river's underground seepage dropped lower each week. Women with children lowered buckets on progressively longer ropes, pulling up water that tasted increasingly of minerals and desperation. Sheriff Horatio Pike enforced the arrangement with legal-sounding phrases about water rights development and private infrastructure investment. His hired guns enforced it with fists, gun barrels pressed against temples, and the occasional body found in inconvenient locations. Any homesteader who protested too loudly found themselves facing trumped-up charges of theft or trespassing. Pike leveraged settler fears expertly. Whispers of Indian trouble and the need for vigilante readiness kept people compliant. Though no native raids had occurred locally in years, newspaper stories from other territories kept suspicions simmering. A Lakota or Comanche face in town triggered immediate wariness, and Pike used that prejudice like a weapon, suggesting that any resistance to his authority might invite the very savage violence everyone feared. Caroline Mercer knew the true cost of protest intimately. Her husband Franklin had stood before the town council the previous spring, waving his homestead deed and demanding free access to the river his land bordered. He'd quoted territorial law, cited established water rights, and called Lockwood and Carr thieves to their faces in front of 20 witnesses. 3 days later, Franklin was found dead at the riverbank, his neck broken, his body wedged between rocks in a manner that suggested violence rather than accident. Fell while fishing. Pike had ruled with barely concealed satisfaction. No witnesses, no investigation. Case closed. Caroline had buried her husband in the cemetery on the hill overlooking their homestead, and then returned to land she could no longer irrigate with 2 children to feed, and winter approaching like a death sentence. The whispers in town told a different story. Maggie, who owned the saloon and heard everything, had mentioned to Dr. Finch that Mean Mike had been boasting while drunk about handling the Mercer problem. Pastor Samuel had seen Shorty Miller riding hard from the direction of the river that morning, his horse lathered despite the early hour. But fear locked tongues as effectively as iron bars. Pike's guns outnumbered any potential resistance, and decent folk with families couldn't risk becoming examples. The homesteaders had learned to keep their heads down, pay their tolls, and pray for rain that never came. Still a few resisted in small, quiet ways. Edward Finch, a war veteran whose right leg had been mangled by Confederate canister shot at Shiloh, treated homesteaders who couldn't pay his fees. He bartered for eggs or labor, accepting whatever people could offer. He'd sewn Caroline's split knuckles after she'd punched through a window to retrieve Tommy, who'd been trapped inside during a particularly vicious dust storm. "Your husband was murdered, Mrs. Mercer," Finch had said quietly as he worked his skilled fingers gentle despite their tremor. "Pike's afraid of folks like you." folks with spines who won't break. Rosalie Hart, the schoolteacher, was barely 23, but sharp as a freshly honed skinning knife. She taught the homesteaders' children in a one-room schoolhouse, supplementing federal textbooks with lessons on civic duty, justice, and the responsibilities of citizenship. She'd helped Caroline hide her last bushel of seed corn when Pike's men had searched homesteads for contraband grain. Isaac Kruger worked as a bank clerk under Lockwood's direct supervision. 35 years old, German-born, he'd fled Europe's political tyrannies, only to discover new ones festering on the American frontier. He kept Lockwood's ledgers with meticulous precision and saw every crooked transaction recorded in neat columns. Guilt gnawed at him constantly, a rat chewing through his conscience. But Isaac had reasons for his silence that went beyond simple cowardice. His mother, Greta, lay bedridden in Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, her lungs ruined by consumption. The medicine she needed, laudanum for the pain, quinine for the fever, cost more than Isaac could afford on any honest wage. Lockwood paid him well, deliberately well, and Isaac knew it was blood money designed to buy his silence. Every night, Isaac sat by his mother's bedside, watching her struggle for breath, and wondered which would kill him first, his conscience or his complicity. Into this powder keg of resentment and fear rode Akacheta of the Ocheti Shakoving and the 7 council fires, as white settlers called the Lakota Confederation. He was 30 years old, a warrior of the Oglala band, and he traveled with 3 companions, his cousin Halona, a woman in her mid-20s, with eyes like flint and a tongue to match, and 2 younger riders, Changtewakang and Wiyakpaka, both in their late teens and eager to prove themselves worthy of their names. They'd come to trade winter pelts for flour ammunition and the metal goods their camp couldn't produce. The trading post owner, a fair-minded Swedish immigrant named Olofsson, dealt honestly with them, rare enough to be worth a 3-day journey. Akacheta carried his own reasons for the journey beyond simple trading. 2 years ago, his younger brother Thathanka Ishta Buffalo Eye had traveled to White River seeking work as a scout for the territorial militia. He'd never returned. The official report claimed he'd deserted, but Akacheta had found his brother's medicine pouch abandoned near the river, torn and blood-stained. No deserter would leave such a sacred object behind. Akacheta had been searching for answers ever since making this journey, annually watching, listening, waiting for truth to surface. And now seeing Pike deny food to starving children while hoarding resources, seeing the fear in people's eyes, he recognized the same corruption that had likely killed his brother. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, clear as if she stood beside him. Generosity is strength. Those who hoard betray their own humanity. He'd stepped forward without calculation, driven by the fundamental Lakota ethic of giving to those in need and by the memory of a brother who died in this town's shadows. Now, in the late afternoon shade behind Olofsson's trading post, Akacheta tended his dung gelding, while Halona inventoried their diminished supplies. She spoke in Lakota, her tone dry as the parched earth. That was foolish, cousin. Pike's hired dogs will remember your face. They may even connect you to Thathanka Ishta if they realize you've been asking questions. Let them remember. Akacheta examined the gelding's hooves with practiced hands, picking out a sharp stone wedged near the frog. The woman thanked you properly, Halona observed, watching him with knowing eyes. She has pride, didn't grovel or weep. Her children were starving. Children starve everywhere in every season. We can't feed them all. Halona's pragmatism wasn't cruelty, merely the survival mathematics they'd all learned. The winters are hard enough for our own. Akacheta straightened, meeting her sharp gaze directly. Then we feed the ones standing in front of us, the ones we can reach. And perhaps, he paused, I find answers about our brother while I'm here. Halona's expression softened slightly. You think Pike knows what happened to him. I think this town swallows people who ask inconvenient questions, Buffalo Eye was asking about water rights, about treaty violations. Then he disappeared. Akacheta's jaw tightened. I won't leave until I know the truth. Caroline used the warrior's bread and beans to make a thin stew that night in the dugout homestead she and Franklin had carved into the hillside 3 years ago. Tommy ate his portion without complaint, though Caroline saw him eyeing the pot hungrily. Elsie fell asleep mid-bite, her small body simply shutting down from exhaustion. Caroline tucked them into the rope bed they shared, smoothing Elsie's damp curls with gentle fingers. She sat at the rough plank table afterward, staring at the empty pot in the lamplight. The warrior's face remained vivid in her mind, not because he was Lakota, though that was remarkable enough in White River, but because he'd acted when every white soul in town had turned away. She thought of Franklin, whose body had grown cold before she'd even learned of his death. Franklin, who'd believed in the law and fairness, in fighting corruption with words and reason. Franklin, whose reward had been a broken neck and a widow left with debts she couldn't pay and children she couldn't feed. Caroline's hands clenched on the table's rough surface. She would repay the debt to the warrior somehow. But more than that, she would finish what Franklin had started. The tolls would end. The stream would flow free again. Or she'd die trying, and at least Tommy and Elsie would know their mother hadn't bowed to tyrants. The lamp flickered, oil running low. Caroline extinguished it to conserve what little remained and sat in the darkness planning. Night settled over White River like a heavy blanket, bringing little relief from the day's brutal heat. Caroline waited until full dark, then lifted the borrowed wooden pail and slipped out of the dugout. The public well near the Methodist church still held a few feet of water, tepid and mineral-heavy but potable. But Pike had ordered it padlocked after sundown, forcing anyone who needed water to either wait until morning or pay bribes to his night guards. Caroline knew the bribe cost 50 cents when she had perhaps 30 cents to her name. She also knew that Arthur Hawkeye Dawes the blacksmith occasionally left his tool shed unlocked after he'd been drinking. If she could borrow a pry bar quietly, she might force the well's padlock, fill her pail, and return before anyone noticed the theft. It was criminal. It was necessary. The line between the two had blurred months ago. She moved through the darkness, with practiced stealth, avoiding the main street where Pike's night patrol lounged outside the saloon. The Methodist church loomed ahead, its whitewashed boards ghostly in the starlight. The well stood in the churchyard, its padlock, a dull gleam catching moonlight. Then she heard the scuffle grunts of effort and the meaty thud of fists impacting flesh, the scrape of boots struggling for purchase in gravel. The sounds came from behind the livery stable, sharp and violent in the quiet night. Caroline froze, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But something, curiosity, or perhaps the reckless courage of someone who'd already lost everything that mattered, pulled her forward. She crept closer and peered around the stable's corner. 3 men had backed a fourth against the stable wall. Even in the darkness, Caroline recognized the fighters. The Lakota warrior who'd given her food stood with his back literally to the wall, blocking vicious punches with his forearms. Mean Mike Mallory swung a knife in short, brutal arcs, trying to open the warrior's belly. Shorty Miller circled with a Remington revolver, trying to find an angle for a clear shot. "Think you can show up the Sheriff Redskin?" Mike snarled between strikes. "Gonna teach you some manners. Teach you what happens to savages who stick their noses in white business." Akacheta caught Mike's wrist, mid-thrust, with snake-quick reflexes twisting hard. Bone ground against bone. The knife clattered to the ground, metal ringing on stone. Shorty thumbed back the Remington's hammer, the metallic double click echoing like a death knell. Caroline didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed her. She ran forward, her voice tearing from her throat. "Stop!" She hurled her wooden pail toward the fighters. It clanged and clattered loudly across the rocky ground. Shorty's head whipped around toward the noise. Akacheta used the distraction, instantly lunging forward to tackle the gunman. The Remington discharged with a deafening crack. The bullet plowed into the dirt 3 inches from Caroline's foot. Mike dove for his fallen knife, but Akacheta kicked it away, sending it skittering into shadow. He drove his elbow backward into Mike's ribs. The hired gun staggered away, wheezing. A sharp whistle split the air 3 short bursts. Halona appeared on horseback with Changtewakang and Wiyakpaksa flanking her. Mike and Shorty scrambled to their feet and ran toward the saloon's safety. Caroline stood trembling, her heart hammering. Akacheta rose slowly, his left forearm sliced open. Dark blood soaked his sleeve. He pressed his right hand over the wound. Halona dismounted, her expression fierce. "We need to leave. Now. Before they return with more men." "Wait." Caroline hurried forward. She tore a strip from her underskirt and reached for Akacheta's arm without asking permission. "Let me see." He hesitated, then extended the wounded limb. Caroline worked quickly, her fingers brushing his warm skin. The gash was deep but clean-edged. She bound it tightly, pulling the knot snug. "You'll need it stitched properly," she murmured. "This is just temporary. It will hold until we're clear." His voice was low, strained with pain, but impressively calm. She finally looked up. Their faces were inches apart in the darkness. His gaze held hers, no gratitude, no resentment, just steady acknowledgement. She'd risked herself to save him. He'd risked himself to feed her children. "Thank you," she whispered. "We are even then." But his eyes said they were something more than even now. Halona cleared her throat. "Cousin Pike will come. We should move." Caroline stepped back reluctantly. "Go. Be careful." Akacheta inclined his head. The riders melted into the darkness, leaving Caroline alone with her overturned pail and racing heart, and the certain knowledge that she'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. Dawn brought consequences. Sheriff Pike hammered on Caroline's door at first light, the blows echoing like gunshots. Tommy and Elsie woke with cries of terror. Caroline answered, blocking Pike's view of her children. The sheriff held a warrant hastily scrawled, "Barely legal." "Got a warrant for disturbing the peace and aiding a hostile Indian fugitive." "Fugitive?" Caroline kept her voice level. "He was attacked. I witnessed it." "Funny, that's not how my deputies tell it." Pike's smile revealed tobacco-stained teeth. "They say the savage jumped them. Say you interfered. Now step aside." "You're not taking my children. Not here for your whelps, here for you." Tommy burst past, his mother fists raised. "You leave my ma alone." Pike backhanded the boy casually. Tommy fell, hard blood springing from his split lip. Caroline lunged, but Shorty grabbed her arms, wrenching them behind her back. She fought, kicking backward, but Shorty outweighed her by 80 pounds. A hold-still wildcat. "Ma!" Elsie screamed. Dr. Finch appeared at the property's edge, leaning on his cane. "Sheriff, what in blazes is the meaning of this?" "Official business, Doc. Move along." "Taking a woman in front of her children hardly seems necessary." Finch's voice was steady. "What are the charges?" Pike swung his rifle toward Finch. "I said move along, Doc, unless you want to join her." Finch's jaw tightened. He couldn't fight armed men with his crippled leg. "I'll see to the children, Mrs. Mercer." Caroline stopped struggling. "Tommy, Elsie, go with Dr. Finch. Be good. I'll be back soon, I promise." They dragged her to the jail, a squat adobe building that radiated heat. The cells were iron cages, and the smell unwashed bodies, human waste to spare, was thick enough to choke on. Pike shoved her into a cell and locked the door. "Comfortable, Mrs. Mercer, might be here a spell while I decide what charges stick. Maybe aiding hostiles. Maybe attempted theft, heard you tried to break the well lock." "I did no such thing." My word against yours, widow." He tipped his hat mockingly and left. Caroline sank onto the wooden plank, her wrists aching. Sweat soaked through her dress. She closed her eyes and prayed not for survival, but for her children's safety before whatever came next. Halona found Akacheta sharpening his knife beside their camp, his wounded arm freshly rebound. She dropped cross-legged beside him. "The widow's been arrested." Akacheta's hands stilled. "For what charge?" "Helping you. Pike's calling it aiding a fugitive." Halona's eyes glittered with anger. "The town fears him too much to stand for her." Akacheta sheathed the knife and rose. "Then we stand for her. How if we ride in? They'll shoot us on sight." Akacheta thought of Caroline's steady hands binding his wound, her voice firm despite fear. He thought of her son's defiance, her daughter's corn-husk doll, and he thought of his brother Buffalo Eye, who disappeared asking questions in this same corrupt town. "We find allies," he said. "The doctor, the schoolteacher. We find proof of what Lockwood and Pike have done. Then we show the town, and perhaps I finally learn what happened to Thathanka Ishta." Halona studied him. "You think your brother's death connects to this?" "I think men who murder over water rights would murder over treaty violations." Akacheta's jaw tightened. "And I think it's time for answers." That night, Rosalie Hart slipped through shadows behind the jail. She carried a bundle from Dr. Finch, boiled linen strips soaked in carbolic acid. The back window of Caroline's cell was narrow-barred with iron rods. Rosalie tapped lightly. Caroline's face appeared. "Miss Hart." "Hush." Rosalie pushed the bundle through. "For cleaning wounds." "He's not here." "He is now. Pike arrested him this afternoon. 3 cells down from you." Caroline's heart lurched. She pressed against the bars, peering into the dimness. Far down the row, she glimpsed a silhouette, broad shoulders, long dark hair. "Akacheta." A faint response. "I am here." Relief and horror warred in Caroline's chest. "You shouldn't have come back. Neither should you have intervened last night." His voice carried dry humor despite circumstances. "But here we both are." Rosalie pulled her shawl tighter. "I must go. Dr. Finch has your children safe. There are people working on this, Mrs. Mercer." "Thank you," Caroline whispered. Rosalie vanished. Caroline crept to the far side of her cell, trying to see Akacheta's shape. "Are you hurt, besides the arm?" "The arm is infected. It will pass." She couldn't tell if that was truth or stoicism. Caroline tore a strip from the linen, wet it from her water gourd, and tried to reach through the bars. Her shoulders scraped painfully against iron. "I can't reach you." "It's no matter." "It matters." Her voice came out fierce. "You helped us when no one else would. I will not let you die in this hole." Silence stretched. Then she heard him shift the scrape of cloth on adobe, the clink of chains. His hand appeared through his cell bars, fingers extended toward hers. She stretched until her shoulders screamed, until her fingers brushed his. Not close enough to pass the cloth, but enough to connect skin to skin. The contact was electric grounding. Her fingers curled around his, holding tight through the iron bars that separated them. They stayed that way for a long moment, 2 prisoners in darkness, bound by touch and defiance, and something neither could yet name. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, and she felt her breath catch. "Your husband," Akacheta said quietly. "Pike killed him." "Yes." Caroline's throat tightened. "I can't prove it. But I know. When we expose them, Lockwood Carr Pike will prove it. Your husband will have justice." He paused. "And perhaps I'll finally learn what happened to my brother." He came to this town 2 years ago, seeking work as a scout. He never returned. I found his medicine pouch by the river torn and blood-stained. Pike claimed he deserted, but no Lakota warrior abandons his sacred objects. Caroline's fingers tightened around his. They killed him too. I believe so. Which is why I won't leave until I have proof. His voice was steady. And why I won't let them kill you or your children. We survive this together or not at all. Heat that had nothing to do with the stifling cell flushed through Caroline. We barely know each other. I know you're brave. I know you fight for your children. I know your hands are steady when others would shake. What more do I need to know? She had no answer. They stayed connected through the bars until her arm went numb, and even then she was reluctant to let go. Hours before dawn, Isaac Kruger approached the jail on shaking legs. He'd spent the evening forcing down whiskey for courage. He carried keys he'd lifted from Pike's desk a moment of opportunity when the sheriff had stepped out. He unlocked the back door and crept into the cell block. Caroline sat upright instantly. "Who's there?" "Isaac Kruger. I'm getting you out." His whisper was urgent, terrified. "What? No, you'll be killed." Isaac fumbled the key into her cell door. "I saw what Pike did to your boy. I watched through the bank window and did nothing." The lock clicked open. "I will not stand by again." He moved to Akacheda's cell. The warrior rose slowly, favoring his left side, fever-bright eyes, visible even in darkness. "You risk much, friend." "Not friend yet, but maybe soon." Isaac's hands shook as he worked the lock. "There are ledgers in the bank. Evidence of fraud, drought relief, diverted deeds, forged payoffs recorded. If we expose them, the town will turn." Akacheta stepped out, his presence filling the corridor. "You will help us get these ledgers." "I'll try, but I need 2 days to find the right books without Lockwood noticing." Isaac's voice cracked. "And you cannot be seen. Pike's put a $50 bounty on you every unemployed cowhand will be hunting." "I'll walk free when the town sees the truth," Akacheta said flatly. "The truth won't matter if you're dead before we can show it." Isaac grabbed Akacheta's good arm. "That widow's children need proof of who killed their father. You're the only one bold enough to help find it. If Pike keeps you locked up, that infection will kill you in 3 days. Do you understand?" Akacheta's jaw clenched. He looked at Caroline, who nodded slowly. "He's right. We can't expose anything from behind bars." Reluctantly, Akacheta nodded. 2 days. Then we act." Caroline stepped closer to Isaac. "What about me when Pike finds I'm gone?" "He'll assume you fled north. It buys time." Isaac ushered them toward the back door. "Go to the old Hanson dugout. It's abandoned. Halona knows where. Wait for my signal." They slipped into darkness. Caroline paused at the threshold, looking back. Then she followed Akacheti into the scrub brush, her bare feet finding purchase on rocky ground. Behind them, Isaac locked the cells and replaced the keys, his hands shaking violently. He was now a conspirator, a jailbreaker, a traitor to the men who paid his wages. But his mother's labored breathing, her pain-racked body, her desperate need for medicine, all of it had been bought with blood money. He couldn't live with that anymore. For the first time in years, Isaac Kruger felt like a man rather than a coward. But he also felt the weight of Pike's leverage. If the sheriff discovered his betrayal, his mother would lose her medicine, her room, perhaps her life. The thought terrified him more than his own death. Dr. Edward Finch woke before dawn to urgent pounding. He lit a lamp and limped downstairs to find Mary Kowalski cradling her youngest daughter, Jenny. "Doc, please, she's burning with fever, can't keep even water down." Finch examined Jenny by lamplight, high fever, severe chills, vomiting, diarrhea. The sixth child that week, with identical symptoms, all from homesteads downstream from Carr's stock pond. How long has she been sick? 3 days. Started right after those big rains. Mary's voice broke. We drank from the creek, thought the storm would have cleaned it good. Finch's mind raced. The rainstorm 2 weeks ago had been violent, 2 inches in an hour. Carr's men had been blasting to deepen the stock pond around that time. The explosions would have churned up sediment, possibly arsenic-bearing rock. All that fouled runoff would have washed downstream. He treated Jenny with willow bark tea and boiled water with salt and sugar. But he couldn't cure poisoned water. After Mary left, he penned a letter to the Territorial Health Commissioner and then walked to the old Hanson dugout. He found Caroline there with Akasheta Halona and the younger riders. Tommy and Elsie were present. Finch had brought them, reasoning they were safer with their mother. Children are dying, Finch said without preamble. Sick this week. Carr's blasting fouled the creek with runoff sediment minerals, possibly arsenic. I've documented it, but that will take weeks. Meanwhile, people drink poison or die of thirst. Caroline's face paled. Tommy drank from the creek 4 days ago. Finch examined Tommy. No fever, yet no signs of acute poisoning. He's clear for now. But boil everything. Don't let the children near the creek until the sluice is opened and clean water flows. We need to break the diversion. Akacheta said, his voice rougher than usual. The springs feed the upper river with clean water. If we open the sluice fully, fresh flow will reach town. Pike will kill anyone who tries. Finch countered. He's got a 15-man posse, every unemployed drunkard who wants $50 for your scalp. Then we need proof before we act, Caroline said. Proof so damning the town has to stand with us. Finch nodded. Isaac's working on it. He sent word through Rosalie he's found something. Forgery, possibly murder evidence. He needs one more night. Akacheta's hand rested on his knife hilt. One more night, more children sicken. Fewer than will die if we charge without a plan and get massacred. Finch snapped. Then more gently, justice has to be strategic, not just brave. Akacheta's jaw worked, but he nodded. Caroline reached out her hand, settling on his uninjured forearm, a gesture of solidarity. He glanced down at her fingers, then met her eyes. The look that passed between them was wordless, but heavy with shared frustration and something deeper. The next 7 days crawled past with agonizing slowness. Pike's newly formed Citizens Guard set up roadblocks on every trail, claiming to search for stolen property and escaped criminals. Caroline ventured out at midday to trade her last silver spoon for cornmeal. She brought Tommy and Elsie, reasoning they were safer in her sight. Halona stayed with Akacheta, who was resting to fight his worsening fever. On a narrow trail near red sandstone outcroppings, 3 guards blocked her way. She recognized them: Rusty McLean, Gus Porter, and young Nate Wilson. Rusty stepped forward, grinning. Where you headed, Mrs. Mercer? Trading. That's not your concern. Everything's our concern now. Sheriff deputized us special. Says you're harboring fugitives. Gonna have to search that basket. Caroline clutched it tighter. You have no authority. Gus knocked the basket from her hands. The spoon flew out, landing in the parched earth. Cornmeal she'd been hoping to trade for spilled uselessly. Elsie cried out. Tommy lunged forward with 8-year-old fury. You give that back! Gus shoved the boy down hard. Tommy's head cracked against a rock, drawing blood. Caroline screamed and dove toward her son, but Rusty kicked at her shin hard enough to buckle her knee. She stumbled, catching herself on a boulder, feeling skin tear from her palms. You'll answer for that! Caroline said through gritted teeth. Nate drew his pistol with slow deliberation. "Shut your mouth, widow, or I'll shut it permanent." A low whistle cut through the air, 3 notes clear and sharp. All 3 guards froze. From the brush emerged Akacheta on his dun gelding, moving with eerie silence. He had no rifle drawn, only his bow slung across his back and his knife at his hip, but his presence radiated controlled danger. He positioned the horse between Caroline and the guards. Even weakened by fever, something in his stillness made violence seem inevitable. "That's enough," Akacheta said quietly. Rusty's hand dropped to his gun. "You got a lot of nerve, Redskin. Sheriff's got a bounty on you. $50 dead or alive." "Then collect it." Akacheta's voice was flat challenging. "But the woman and her children leave first." The 3 guards exchanged glances. Without Pike present, they were just men facing someone who'd fought Crow Raiders and survived battlefields. Rumors of his skill had spread through the territory. Gus spat brown tobacco juice. "This ain't over, Mercer. You or your savage friend." "It is for today." Akacheta didn't move until the guards backed off, muttering threats. Once they disappeared, Akacheta dismounted with a grimace of pain. Caroline knelt in the parched earth, gathering the spilled contents with shaking hands, her palms bleeding. He crouched beside her, his arm brushing hers as they worked. The touch was brief, but neither pulled away immediately. "You shouldn't have come," Caroline murmured. "They'll report this. Pike will double the patrols. Let them report." Akacheta scooped the last items into her basket. "Can you ride?" "I've never ridden alone." "You won't be alone." He helped her to her feet, his hand steadying her elbow. Then he lifted Elsie onto the gelding. Tommy climbed up behind his sister. Akacheta took the reins and led them along a hidden deer trail, walking beside Caroline's limping form. The sun climbed higher, pressing down with relentless heat. "Your husband," Akacheta said after a while. "He protested the tolls. That's why Pike killed him." "Yes." Caroline's throat tightened. "I can't prove it. No witnesses came forward. When we expose them, Pike will fall. Your husband will have justice even if it comes late." He paused. "And perhaps I'll finally learn what happened to my brother." "I think they're connected." Both men asked inconvenient questions about corruption. "If they killed your brother, they'll pay for that too." She glanced at him, noting the fever flush on his cheeks. "You're still sick. You should be resting." "I couldn't let them hurt you." The admission was quiet, almost reluctant. Heat flushed Caroline's cheeks. "You hardly know me." "I know enough." His hand brushed hers as he helped her over rough ground, and this time the touch lingered. Their eyes met. Something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable. Then he released her hand, and they continued walking. But the warmth remained, and Caroline found herself acutely aware of every inch of space between them. That night, Isaac finally achieved what he'd been working toward. Lockwood left the office early, complaining of stomach trouble. This gave Isaac precious hours alone. He'd spent weeks watching Lockwood work the safe's combination. Now, hands shaking, he spun the dial right to 15 left, passed it twice to 32, right to 7. The lock clicked open. Inside, behind stacks of papers, lay a leather folio tied with string. Isaac opened it to find homestead deeds, including Franklin Mercer's. He compared Franklin's deed to the version filed in the county register. The differences leapt out. The original, sealed in 1878, guaranteed Franklin free water access by riparian rights. But the version Lockwood had filed 6 months ago was forged, and the seal was off-center. The signature strokes didn't match, and the date read 1879 when Franklin was verifiably elsewhere. A note clipped to the forgery in Pike's scrawl read, Original lost in office fire. Replacement processed per owner request. No toll exemption noted. There had been no fire. This was fraud. Isaac kept searching. At the bottom of the folio, he found a payment voucher, a receipt from Pike to Mean Mike Mallory, dated April 12, 1885, 3 days before Franklin's body was discovered. The line item read, "Services rendered per arrangement, $50. Isaac's hands shook with rage. This was premeditated murder for hire. He continued through the safe. Ledger pages showed federal drought relief grain rerouted to Carr's Ranch with Pike's countersignature. The dates correlated with the worst food shortages. But then Isaac found something else, something that made his blood run cold. A separate ledger entry dated 2 years ago in Lockwood's hand. Payment to H. Pike disposal of Lakota Scout Treaty investigation matter. $100. Body disposed in river downstream. Effects destroyed except medicine pouch retained as proof of completion. Below it, a notation in Pike's hand item, secured in office drawer as insurance. Isaac's breath caught. This was evidence of Akacheta's brother's murder, proof that Pike had killed Buffalo Eye for investigating treaty violations and water theft, and Pike had kept the medicine pouch as leverage proof he'd completed the job. Isaac carefully removed all the key documents, Franklin's original deed, the forged replacement, both payment vouchers, the ledger pages showing grain diversions, and the entry about the Lakota Scout's murder. He folded them into his shirt. Then he heard footsteps outside. His heart stopped. Lockwood was returning. Isaac could hear his distinctive cough. There was no time to lock the safe properly. Isaac shoved the folio back, spun the dial randomly, and dove behind a filing cabinet. Lockwood entered, still coughing. He went straight to his desk, poured whiskey from a flask, and sat heavily. Isaac held his breath, pressed against the wallpapers, crackling against his chest. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, Lockwood rose and left again, muttering about needing fresh air. Isaac waited another agonizing minute, then slipped out the back door, ran through darkness toward the Hanson dugout, clutching the evidence that could save them all or get him killed. When Isaac burst into the dugout, gasping, they crowded around Carolyn, Akacheta, Halona, Dr. Finch, and Rosalie. He spread the papers on the dirt floor. By lamplight, he explained each piece: the forged deed, the mismatched signatures, the payment to Mallory, the diverted grain. Then he held up the final page, his voice shaking. And this is proof that Sheriff Pike murdered a Lakota scout 2 years ago, a man investigating treaty violations and water theft. Pike kept his medicine pouch as proof of the killing. Akacheta went absolutely still. What was the scout's name? Isaac squinted at the faded notation. It just says, Lakota Scout Treaty Investigation. But there's a reference to a medicine pouch with, I can't quite read it. Something about Buffalo Eye. Akacheta's voice was barely audible. Tathanka Ishta, my brother. The dugout fell silent. Caroline reached for his hand instinctively, finding it clenched into a fist. She wrapped her fingers around his, feeling the tremor running through him. I'm sorry, Isaac whispered. I'm so sorry. Akacheta's eyes burned with grief and rage. Where's the pouch? The entry says Pike kept it. His office, according to this. Locked in a drawer as insurance. Isaac swallowed. He probably planned to use it as evidence if anyone questioned the desertion story. Halona's hand settled on Akacheta's shoulder. Cousin, we will make them pay for this. I swear it on the ancestors. Yes. Akacheta's voice was steel. We will. But first, he turned to Isaac. You've risked everything bringing us this. If Pike discovers what you've taken, you and your mother are both dead. Isaac's face crumpled. I know. But I couldn't. I couldn't keep being complicit. My mother would rather die than know her son enabled murder. He took a shuddering breath. I just hope we act fast enough that Pike doesn't realize the documents are missing. We move tomorrow night, Akacheta said. During the storm, we open the sluice, we show the town the evidence, and we get that medicine pouch back. Pike will pay for both murders, Caroline's husband and my brother. Caroline's fingers tightened around his. I'm so sorry about Buffalo Eye. If I'd known you had your own grief, your own fight. Akacheta's thumb brushed her knuckles, a gesture of comfort despite his own pain. But now our fights are the same. We finish this together. They spent the rest of the night planning. Caroline would bring the children to Rosalie's schoolhouse, where Rosalie would announce a free doctoring at the schoolhouse. Doc Finch will see the children, a medical event to draw townsfolk and occupy Pike's attention. While the clinic created distraction, Akacheta, Caroline, Isaac, Halona, and the younger riders would slip upriver to the sluice. They'd break the lock, open the gates, and return with physical proof. But now, they had an additional objective: retrieve Buffalo Eye's medicine pouch from Pike's office, giving Akacheta the closure he'd sought for 2 years. It was desperate. It was dangerous. If caught, they'd all hang. But as Caroline watched Elsie sleep and thought of Jenny Kowalski and the other poisoned children, and as Akacheta stared at the evidence of his brother's murder with eyes that burned, she knew waiting was deadlier than action. The storm rolled in at dusk the next day, with all the drama Akacheta had predicted. Clouds, the color of bruises, piled up against the western mountains, shot through with lightning. Thunder rumbled like distant artillery, and the first fat raindrops hit the streets with impacts that left craters in the alkaline powder. Rosalie stood on the schoolhouse steps, ringing the bell. Free health examination for all children. Dr. Finch is checking for summer fevers and providing preventive treatment. Mothers began arriving. Dr. Finch appeared with his medical bag, lending legitimacy. Pike, watching from the saloon porch with Shorty, frowned, but couldn't shut it down without appearing tyrannical. Meanwhile, Isaac led the others through rain-soaked darkness along the river's edge. Caroline had left Tommy and Elsie with Rosalie, her heart breaking at their frightened faces. Now she moved through the storm, soaked within minutes, a crowbar in her hands and cold fear in her belly. They reached Willows 100 yards downstream from the sluice. The structure loomed ahead, massive timber frame iron fittings, gleaming gates groaning under diverted current. A single lantern swayed in the wind. They crept forward through willow scrub and cattails, rain covering any sound. The river roared to their left, swollen with storm runoff. Caroline's boots squelched in mud. They reached the gate mechanism, a massive iron handwheel bolted to a vertical shaft. A padlock as thick as Caroline's wrist secured it. The wheel raises the gate. Isaac whispered, water streaming down his face. If we can break the lock or tear the wheel free, water will flow through the main channel. Akacheta examined the lock. We need leverage. Caroline wedged the crowbar under the lock's shackle. Akacheta grasped it with her, their shoulders pressed together as they strained. The metal groaned, but held. Halona added her weight. The lock snapped with a sharp crack swallowed by thunder. The sound had been loud enough. Shouts rose from upstream guards emerging from shelter. Figures moved in darkness. Turn the wheel, Akacheta ordered. Caroline and Isaac grabbed the handwheel spokes, pulling with everything they had. It resisted, rusted and stiff. Isaac's face purpled with effort. The wheel turned an inch. Then another. Gunfire erupted. Bullets whined past one splintering timber 6 inches from Caroline's head. She flinched, but didn't let go. Changtewakang and Wiyakpaka returned fire reports sharp, even through the storm's chaos. An arrow buried itself in Changtewakang's thigh. The young man cried out and stumbled. Uyakpaka dragged him behind a timber support. "Keep pulling," Akacheta shouted. The wheel moved faster now. Water surged against the gate. With a grinding roar, the gate lifted 6 inches. Current blasted through the gap, roaring downstream. But 6 inches wasn't enough. They needed 2 more feet. Then Isaac froze his face, going white. "Oh no, oh no, no, no." Caroline glanced at him. "What's wrong?" "They know." Isaac's voice cracked. "Pike knows I took the documents. He sent me a message this afternoon through Mrs. Patterson, said if I don't return them by dawn, my mother dies. I didn't tell you because I thought if we succeeded tonight, it wouldn't matter. But if we fail, you were going to betray us?" Halona's voice was ice. "No, I don't know." Isaac's hands shook on the wheel. "I came here to help, I swear, but if my mother dies because of me..." A bullet cracked past close enough that Caroline felt the wind of its passage. "We can't discuss this now. We have to finish." But Isaac had released the wheel, backing away, his face a mask of anguish. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't let her die. She's all I have." "Isaac, no." Caroline lunged for him, but he turned and ran into the storm, disappearing into darkness. The wheel, no longer held, began to slip backward. The gate started to lower. Water pressure decreased. "Blast it." Akacheta grabbed the wheel, trying to hold it, but without Isaac's help, it was too much weight. His wounded arms screamed in protest, fever weakening him. Caroline threw herself at the wheel beside him, pulling with desperate strength. But they were losing ground, the mechanism reversing. Then Halona was there, and Wayakpaka, despite his injured companion, and they pulled together with synchronized desperation. The wheel held steady, then grudgingly turned forward again. More gunfire, more shouts. Pike himself arrived with 6 more riders, and the fight escalated into chaos. "The upper timber," Caroline shouted, pointing to the storm-loosened cribbing. "If we can pull it loose." "I'll climb," Akacheta said. "Wait." Caroline grabbed his arm, fear spiking through her. "If you fall." His hand covered hers, briefly warm despite the cold rain. "I won't." He met her eyes. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement of feeling of connection, of the terrifying possibility that this might be goodbye. "Hold the wheel steady." He climbed. The timbers were slick with rain, treacherous. Caroline and the others braced, the wheel fingers aching, watching Akacheta's progress with mounting dread. Halfway up, Vincenzo Carr appeared from the darkness, wild-eyed, carrying a hissing stick of dynamite. "You're destroying my property. I'll blow you all to blazes." He hurled it toward the structure's base. Akacheta saw it mid-climb. Without hesitation, he dropped 10 feet of controlled fall, landed in a crouch that sent pain lancing through his wounded arm, and caught the dynamite mid-air. The fuse had burned to almost nothing. Time slowed. Akacheta pivoted and hurled the dynamite into Carr's stock pond. It hit the water and exploded beneath the surface, sending a geyser 30 feet into the storm-dark sky. Caroline's heart stopped, then restarted with painful force. Sweet mercy. Akacheta was already climbing again, moving faster now, recklessness born of necessity. Caroline's hands trembled on the wheel. She'd never felt fear like this, watching someone she cared about risk everything, utterly helpless to protect him. He reached the top cribbing. He wedged the crowbar. Halona had thrown it up under the loose timber and pulled. The log shifted, splintering. He braced his feet and pulled again. Below, more of Pike's men arrived, 6 riders, rifles raised. Pike himself led them, his face twisted with fury. "Shoot them! Shoot them all!" Bullets shredded the air. One caught Isaac, who'd returned guilt, overcoming fear, in the shoulder. He spun, clutching the papers inside his shirt. "Don't let them get wet," he gasped. Halona grabbed him, dragging him to cover while firing one-handed. Caroline saw mean Mike Mallory climbing onto a sluice, pier knife in hand, making for her position. Memory flashed. This knife had killed Franklin. Rage flooded through her. She grabbed a timber length and swung with fury-augmented strength. It cracked across Mike's knuckles. Bones crunched. The knife tumbled into the current. Akacheta gave one final massive pull. The timber broke free with a crack like a rifle shot. Water slammed through the widened gap with terrifying power. The structure groaned. The pier where Mike stood shifted suddenly. He staggered arms, windmilling. Then the pier collapsed and he plunged into the torrent, screaming. The current seized him and swept him downstream. Akacheta leaped from the collapsing framework, landing hard beside Caroline. The impact drove breath from his lungs. She grabbed his arm, steadying him, their faces inches apart. "You're alive," she breathed. Before she could think, she threw her arms around him. He stiffened in surprise. Then his arms came around her, holding her tight against his chest for one perfect heartbeat, while chaos raged around them. His heart hammered against her cheek. Rain poured over them both. "We have to move." Halona's voice cut through. Pikes rallying. They broke apart and ran through mud, through gunfire, through the storm. Water roared behind them, reclaiming its stolen path. But they weren't running toward safety. They were running toward town, toward Pike's office, toward the medicine pouch that held Buffalo Eye's memory, toward the final confrontation. Behind them, Pike's posse gave chase through the rain-lashed forest, and the hunt became a desperate race for survival. The forest was a nightmare of slick mud, grasping branches, and thunder that shook the earth. Caroline ran beside Akacheta, her lungs burning, legs screaming protest. Behind them, Pike's men crashed through undergrowth, their shouts punctuated by gunfire. A bullet cracked past Caroline's ear, so close she felt its heat. She stumbled, and Akacheta's hand shot out, catching her elbow, pulling her forward. "Don't stop." They burst from tree line onto open ground. The town lay ahead, lights flickering through sheets of rain. But between them and safety stretched 200 yards of exposed terrain. "They'll cut us down in the open," Halona shouted. "We split up," Akacheta ordered. "Halona, take the wounded to the schoolhouse. Show them the evidence. Caroline and I go for Pike's office. We get the medicine pouch." "That's suicide." Halona grabbed his arm. "It's necessary." Akacheta's eyes burned with fever and determination. "My brother deserves proper burial rites. I won't leave without his sacred object." Halona cursed in Lakota, but nodded. She helped the injured Isaac and Changtawakang toward the schoolhouse Wiyakpaka, covering them. Akacheta and Caroline ran toward the sheriff's office, a small building adjacent to the jail. They reached it just as Pike and 4 riders emerged from the forest edge. "There," Pike roared. "Don't let them reach my office." Akacheta kicked the door open. They dove inside as bullets punched through wood. The office was cramped, a desk, filing cabinets, gun racks. Akacheta went straight for the desk, searching drawers with frantic hands. Caroline grabbed a rifle from the rack, checked the load, and fired through the shattered window. The report was deafening in the confined space. Outside, one of Pike's men yelped and fell back. "Find it!" she shouted, firing again. Akacheta tore through drawer after drawer. Papers scattered. Then his hands closed on something wrapped in doe skin. He pulled it out, a leather pouch decorated with quillwork, a buffalo symbol painted on the front. His brother's medicine pouch. For one moment, Akacheta went absolutely still, cradling the pouch against his chest. Caroline saw his shoulders shake, grief overwhelming him despite the danger. Then the window exploded inward as Pike hurled a chair through it. The sheriff came through behind it, Colt leveled. "You murdering savage, you destroyed my town." Akacheta moved with cobra speed, tackling Pike before he could fire. They crashed into the desk, grappling. The Colt discharged into the ceiling. Caroline grabbed another rifle, but Shorty Miller appeared in the doorway, Springfield raised. She fired first. The bullet caught Shorty in the leg, dropping him. Pike and Akacheta fought with brutal intensity. Pike was heavier, but Akacheta was faster despite his fever. They rolled across the floor, each struggling for advantage. Pike's hand found his knife. He slashed at Akacheta's face. Akacheta jerked back the blade, missing by inches, and drove his fist into Pike's throat. The sheriff gagged, loosening his grip. Caroline saw more men approaching through the rain. They were out of time. "Akacheta, we have to go." Akacheta grabbed Pike's collar, slamming his head against the floor once hard. The sheriff went limp. Akacheta snatched up his brother's medicine pouch and lunged toward Caroline. They ran out the back door into the alley. Behind them, Pike's remaining men poured into the office. Ahead, the alley opened onto the main street, where the crowd from Rosalie's clinic had spilled out, drawn by the gunfire and the sound of rushing water. The fountain in the square was gushing water pouring from the stone spout for the first time in months. The stone spout in the square had been dry since spring. Now water leapt from it, as if the town had finally exhaled. Women and children stood in the rain, staring in disbelief. Akacheta and Caroline stumbled into the square, soaked and bleeding. Halona was there, holding up the sodden documents. Dr. Finch stood beside her, and Rosalie and Arthur Dawes, the blacksmith. "These are bank records." Rosalie's voice carried across the square. "Proof that Pike and Lockwood forged deeds, diverted federal aid, and murdered Franklin Mercer and a Lakota scout investigating their crimes." Pike burst from the alley. Colt raised his face purple with rage. "Lies, all lies from criminals and savages." Akacheta stepped forward, holding up his brother's medicine pouch. "This belonged to Thathanka Ishta Buffalo Eye of the Oglala. Your ledger shows you murdered him 2 years ago for investigating treaty violations. You kept his sacred object as proof of the killing. I found it in your desk." Gasps swept the crowd. Pike's gun hand wavered. Caroline moved to stand beside Akacheta, her voice ringing clear. "And this," she held up Franklin's original deed, "proves my husband had legal water rights. Pike and Lockwood forged a replacement to justify their tolls. Then Pike paid Mean Mike Mallory to murder Franklin. We have the payment voucher." Dr. Finch stepped forward. "And I have medical documentation of 6 children poisoned by contaminated water from Carr's illegal blasting. 1 nearly died." The crowd's mood shifted visibly. Arthur Dawes leveled his Winchester at Pike. "You forged documents. You starved children. You murdered for money." Other homesteaders raised their rifles. Gustav Johann Samuel. The balance tipped. Pike's gun hand dropped. He saw his authority crumbling, saw the town turning against him. His eyes found Caroline, found Akacheta, and burned with impotent fury. "You'll all hang for this," he spat. "I'll see every last one of you." "No," Akacheta said quietly. "You will." They dragged Pike to the jail he'd used to oppress them. The citizens' guard melted away, unwilling to die for wages that would stop the moment their employer was arrested. Carr had fled during the chaos, but was captured by Waya, a Cherokee by birth, who'd spent a childhood winter with a Comanche camp, and later rode cattle with them and the Comanche-raised cattleman who'd switched sides after seeing Pike's corruption firsthand. Shorty Miller vanished into the rain and was never seen again. Rumor placed him in California, Kansas, or dead in a gulch. In the aftermath, as the storm finally broke and dawn approached, They gathered in the saloon. Caroline sat with Tommy and Elsie, both children clinging to her. Lakota stood nearby, his brother's medicine pouch hanging around his neck where it belonged. Isaac Kruger sat apart, his shoulder bandaged, his face a mask of shame. "I almost betrayed you," he said quietly. "Pike threatened my mother and I. I ran. I'm a coward." "You came back," Caroline said. "You returned despite the danger. That's not cowardice." "I only came back because guilt ate at me. And even then, I hesitated." Isaac looked at Lakota. "Your brother died because men like me stay silent. Franklin died because I kept Lockwood's books and said nothing. How many deaths am I complicit in?" Lakota crossed to Isaac, crouching before him. "You freed us from jail. You stole evidence that will hang corrupt men. You took a bullet protecting those documents." He placed a hand on Isaac's uninjured shoulder. "Fear is not the same as cowardice. You were afraid for your mother, for yourself, but you acted anyway. That's bravery." Isaac's eyes filled with tears. "My mother. Pike's men have her. If he realizes what I've done." "He realizes?" Rosalie interrupted, entering from the back room. "But your mother is here. I sent word to Mrs. Patterson during the clinic. She moved your mother to Dr. Finch's house hours ago, claiming she needed closer medical attention. Your mother is safe, Isaac." Isaac's face crumpled, and he wept great shuddering sobs of relief and shame and exhaustion. Caroline moved to sit beside him, her hand on his back, offering wordless comfort. "We all did what we had to survive," she said quietly. "And when it mattered most, you chose right. That's what counts." Circuit Judge Edward Sinclair arrived 2 days later, summoned by Rosalie's covert telegraph during the clinic. Judge Sinclair had been riding the Northern Circuit. Rosalie's wire caught him at Cottonwood Station, a half-day away. He was an older man with eyes that had seen every variety of frontier corruption. He convened a hearing in the saloon. The entire town crowded in, spilling through doors and windows. Pike, Lockwood, and Carr sat in chains. Isaac testified first, his voice steady despite his bandaged shoulder. He detailed every ledger entry, every diverted shipment. He handed the papers to Sinclair, who examined them with a magnifying glass. Dr. Finch testified about the poisoned children submitting water samples in sealed bottles, one murky and foul-smelling from below the stock pond, one clear from above. Lakota testified about the tolls, the violence, the systematic oppression. Then he held up his brother's medicine pouch. "Sheriff Pike murdered my brother Thathanka Ishta 2 years ago for investigating treaty violations and water theft. Pike documented the killing in Lockwood's ledger and kept my brother's sacred object as proof. I found it in his desk." The courtroom fell silent. Even hardened settlers, many of whom harbored prejudices against Native peoples, looked uncomfortable. Murder was murder regardless of the victim's race. Finally, Caroline testified. She wore her best dress threadbare but clean. She held Franklin's original deed in steady hands, pointing out the county seal, her husband's genuine signature, the explicit water rights clause. "They killed him for speaking truth," she said, meeting Pike's eyes across the room. "They starved my children and poisoned the creek. And when decent people tried to help, they were beaten, jailed, or hunted." Judge Sinclair questioned Pike, whose bluster dissolved under cross-examination. He questioned Lockwood, who crumbled. He questioned Carr, who wept. Then Sinclair examined the evidence with painstaking care. He compared the forged deed to the original under magnifying glass. He studied the payment vouchers. He read the ledger entries documenting Buffalo Eye's murder. The knife recovered from Mean Mike's body. Caroline had retrieved it from the river, with help from townsfolk the day after the storm was presented. Sinclair compared it to Franklin's autopsy report, which Pastor Samuel had preserved. The blade width matched exactly. Finally, after 2 days of testimony, Sinclair delivered his ruling. Horatio Pike, you are convicted of 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, theft of federal property, and abuse of office. You will hang. Pike's face went white. Gabriel Lockwood, you are convicted of fraud, forgery, and accessory to murder. 20 years hard labor. Vincenzo Carr, you are convicted of fraud, reckless endangerment, and theft of public resources. 15 years. Sinclair continued. The sluice structure is declared illegal and forfeited to the town. I am establishing a water committee, Dr. Finch, Rosalie Hart, Arthur Dawes, and 3 homesteaders elected by popular vote, including Caroline Mercer. Water access will be free and equitable. Cheers shook the building. Caroline sank into her chair, her strength finally giving out. Akacheda's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing. 3 months later, as autumn touched the high country with gold, Caroline prepared a celebratory feast in her rebuilt homestead. The corn harvest had come in abundant, not wealthy-making, but sufficient to feed her family through winter with surplus to sell. Akacheda had built a small cabin on Caroline's property near the creek, living there with Halona. The arrangement satisfied frontier propriety while keeping them close enough to help with daily work. The dinner table was crowded, extended with planks covered with mismatched dishes. But it held a feast: roasted chicken cornbread, made with real butter beans, early squash, and apple pie. Tommy and Elsie ran between adults, their laughter clear and bright. They'd filled out their hollow-eyed thinness, replaced with healthy roundness. As twilight deepened, they gathered. Dr. Finch offered a brief blessing, acknowledging survival community and the better angels of human nature. They ate with enthusiasm. Conversation flowed, Isaac describing his new position as town clerk, Rosalie, updating them on her students, Waya, sharing gossip from the cattle market. Akacheta sat beside Caroline, their shoulders occasionally brushing. Under the table, their hands found each other, fingers interlacing naturally. Dr. Finch raised his cup. To absent friends. To Franklin Mercer, who had courage to speak first. To Thathanka Ishta Buffalo Eye, who died seeking justice. And to everyone who's fought for what's right. They drank together, a moment of solemn remembrance. Caroline felt tears prick her eyes, but didn't let them fall. Franklin would have loved this gathering. After dinner, Caroline and Akasheta walked to the creek. The water caught starlight, flowing clear and strong. He wore his brother's medicine pouch around his neck. Buffalo Eye had been given proper burial rites with full ceremony, his spirit finally at peace. I'm staying through winter, Akacheta said quietly. If that's acceptable. It is. Caroline smiled. And spring. Spring too. Halona wants to see the seasonal floods. He paused. Caroline, I need to be clear. I don't know what this is between us, if society will ever truly accept it. I can't promise anything beyond today. I don't need promises, she said, looking up at him. I need honesty, respect, and someone who sees me as I am. You've given me all 3. That's terrifyingly uncertain. Life on this frontier is always uncertain. He touched her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing her jaw. The question isn't whether we'll face obstacles. It's whether we face them together or separately. And I prefer together. Caroline's breath caught. So do I. He kissed her, then gentle and unhurried under stars that had witnessed every human drama since time began. It was a kiss that tasted of promise, without demanding guarantees of affection earned through shared hardship. His lips were warm, despite the cooling night air, moving against hers with careful tenderness. His hand cupped the back of her head, fingers threading through her hair, while his other arm circled her waist, pulling her close against his solid warmth. She melted into him, her hands sliding up his chest to rest on his shoulders, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss deepened slowly, naturally, speaking of grief shared and danger survived, and a future built not on romantic fantasy, but on mutual respect forged in fire. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Caroline was crying, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief of arriving somewhere safe after a brutal journey. "We survived," she whispered against his chest. "We did." Akacheta pulled her close, his chin resting on her hair. "And we'll keep surviving one day at a time until survival becomes living." From the house, laughter echoed Halona, teasing Isaac Rosalie, arguing with Waya, the children shrieking with delight. The sounds of community of life continuing despite everything that had tried to destroy it. They stood by the water until full dark, then walked hand in hand back to the gathering. Lamplight spilled from the windows, like promise itself, golden warm and hard-won. Inside, Akacheta raised his cup one final time. To water that flows free. To justice that came late, but came nonetheless. To those who stand together when standing alone would be easier. And to new families built from courage and choice rather than blood and obligation. "Hear, hear," Dr. Finch echoed. They drank together, and in that moment, Caroline felt the weight of 6 months' grief and fear and desperate struggle finally lift. Not disappear, it would never fully disappear, but transform into something she could carry without being crushed. This was home, this table full of unlikely allies, this land watered by a river, reclaimed this small corner of the territory, where justice had prevailed and kindness had mattered. As she looked around at the faces lit by lamplight, Akacheta beside her, her children safe, and fed her friends who'd risked everything, Caroline realized something profound. Home wasn't just a place. It was people who stood with you when everything fell apart, who fought beside you when odds were impossible, who saw you at your worst and stayed anyway. Tommy climbed into her lap, and Elsie leaned against Akacheta's knee with complete trust. The warrior's hand settled on the child's head with gentle affection, and Caroline's heart expanded to hold more joy than she'd thought possible after Franklin's death. It wasn't the ending she would have written 6 months ago, but it was the ending she'd earned through courage, stubbornness, and refusing to bow. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.